In the heart of what is now Belarus, beneath the towering pines of the Naliboki forest, lies one of World War II's most extraordinary stories of resistance and survival. This is not a tale of armies or governments, but of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity in humanity's darkest hour. The story begins in the rural village of Stankiewicz, nestled in the borderlands between Poland and what would become Belarus. Here, in a world of farmers and millers, 4 brothers would grow up to defy an empire of darkness. Tuvia, Asael, Zus, and Aaron Bielski were 4 of 12 children born to David and Bela Bielski. Their father operated the local mill. Their mother tended to a household that never seemed quiet. They were the only Jewish family in Stankiewicz, a reality that would shape every day of their lives. Far from any urban center, isolated from larger Jewish communities, the Bielski boys learned early that survival meant standing up for themselves. Their father, David, preferred negotiation to confrontation, but his sons inherited a different temperament entirely. The Bielski brothers developed what you might call a warrior mentality out of necessity. They couldn't rely on law enforcement or community support when faced with anti-Semitism. They had to create their own justice. Tuvia emerged as the intellectual among them, tall, dark-haired, with movie star looks that earned him comparisons to Clark Gable. He devoured books and could captivate listeners with religious stories that illuminated life's complexities. But beneath his refined exterior lay the same steel that ran Asael. The middle son was the family anchor, hardworking, loyal, destined to inherit their father's mill. Zus was the hothead, quick with his fists, and constantly in trouble with authorities. Even young Aaron, barely a teenager when war erupted, possessed the cunning and courage that would make him. What made the Bielski brothers unique wasn't just their individual strengths, but how those strengths complemented each other. Tuvia's vision, Asael's steadiness, Zus's fearlessness, Aaron's intelligence. Separately they were formidable, together they were unstoppable. The tranquil village suddenly filled with the rumble of engines and marching boots. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the morning calm across Eastern Europe. 3.5 million Axis troops poured across the Soviet border, bringing with them an ideology that would transform neighbors into executioners and survival into an act of defiance. For the Jews of Belarus, the German arrival meant immediate terror. Mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen followed close behind the advancing army, systematically murdering Jewish civilians in village after village. Overcrowded, desperate conditions. Families huddled together behind barbed wire. Those who weren't immediately murdered were herded into ghettos. In nearby Novogrudok, thousands of Jews were crammed into a few city blocks, subjected to starvation, disease, and the constant threat of selections, the Nazi euphemism for mass murder. You couldn't plan for tomorrow because you didn't know if tomorrow would come. Every morning we woke up wondering if this would be the day they came for us. The brothers huddled around a dim candle, their faces etched with grief and determination. By December 1941, the war had claimed David and Bela Bielski, along with 2 of their younger children. The brothers who had once fought village bullies now faced an enemy that sought to erase their entire people from existence. But where others saw hopelessness, the Bielski brothers saw opportunity. If the established order had abandoned them, they would create their own. The Naliboki forest had sheltered rebels and outcasts for generations. Now it would become sanctuary for those with nowhere else to turn. In the spring of 1942, Tuvia Bielski made a decision that would save over 1,200 lives. At first, it was just relatives, a dozen or so survivors seeking shelter from the Nazi storm. Many were city dwellers, terrified of the wilderness that Tuvia insisted was their only hope for survival. Tuvia understood something his brothers initially missed, that their survival was meaningless if it came at the cost of abandoning their people. When Asael and Zus wanted to keep the group small and manageable, Tuvia declared, "I would rather save one old Jewish woman than kill 10 Nazi soldiers." A word spread through the ghettos and hiding places of western Belarus. The Bielski brothers were accepting anyone who could reach them. Young and old, men and women, fighters and scholars, craftsmen and farmers. By autumn 1942, nearly 100 souls called the forest home. It seemed like a fantasy from another world. After the suffocation of the ghetto, suddenly we had space to breathe. Children laughing, people arguing politics around campfires. It felt like heaven. But this forest haven was no vacation retreat. Every day brought new challenges, finding food for hundreds of people, avoiding German patrols, dealing with hostile local populations who might betray them for a reward. The brothers organized their community with military precision. Tuvia commanded overall operations, Asael served as his deputy, and Zus led reconnaissance missions that grew increasingly bold and dangerous. The Bielski group wasn't content to simply hide. Working alongside Soviet partisans, they launched guerrilla attacks against German supply lines, transportation networks, and collaborators who aided in Jewish persecution. In October 1942, Bielski and Soviet fighters ambushed a German convoy, killing at least one German soldier and capturing valuable supplies. For Tuvia, it was more than a military victory. It was satisfying in a larger sense, a real spiritual high point. The world should know that there were still Jews alive, and especially Jewish partisans. But even as they struck back at their oppressors, Tuvia never lost sight of his primary mission, saving Jewish lives. Every decision was weighed against this sacred obligation. What distinguished the Bielski group was their commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of their community. Other partisan groups focused purely on military objectives. The Bielskis understood that preserving Jewish culture and Jewish life was itself an act of resistance. The forest community developed its own economy, its own social structures, its own methods of justice. There were workshops and schools, romances and marriages, births and celebrations, life asserting itself against a machinery of death. Winter brought new torments, temperatures that could kill the unprepared, food shortages that threatened starvation, and increased German efforts to locate and destroy partisan strongholds. The brothers faced impossible choices daily. How much risk was acceptable to gather food? How many new refugees could they absorb without compromising everyone's safety? When should they fight, and when should they run? We lived with death as our constant companion, but also with hope. Every morning we survived was a victory. Every child's laugh was an act of defiance. German anti-partisan operations intensified throughout 1943. Massive sweeps involving thousands of troops calmed the forests, forcing the Bielskis to constantly relocate their camps and disperse their people. Survival often meant hours or days of absolute silence. Discovery meant certain death not just for fighters, but for every man, woman, and child in the group. The psychological pressure was unimaginable. These weren't trained soldiers, they were teachers, shopkeepers, students, elderly grandparents, yet they found within themselves reserves of courage that enabled not just survival, but active resistance. As the war progressed, tensions emerged within the partisan movement. Some Soviet commanders questioned the Bielskis' commitment to protecting non-combatants, arguing that military efficiency required abandoning the old, the sick, and the young. We're not just fighting to kill Germans. We're fighting to save Jewish lives, to preserve Jewish dignity, to ensure our people have a future beyond this war. Tuvia's moral vision often put him at odds with other partisan leaders who viewed the war purely through a military lens. But he never wavered from his conviction that saving lives was as important as taking them. The Bielski group became more than a military unit. It was a mobile Jewish community determined to preserve not just life, but culture, education, and values. They held religious services, celebrated holidays, and maintained the traditions that Hitler sought to eradicate. My brothers Asael and Zus, they would never have taken all those people. They would have kept their wives and girlfriends, but they wouldn't have chosen to save all those old people and children. That was Tuvia's decision, and it saved 1,200 lives. After more than 3 years in the forest, the Bielski group emerged from the woods over 1,200 strong. They had accomplished something unprecedented in the Holocaust. Not only had they survived, they had saved more Jewish lives than any other resistance group in Nazi-occupied Europe. The war's end scattered the Bielski group across the globe. Some remained in the Soviet Union, others made their way to Israel, America, and elsewhere. They carried with them the memory of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept the unacceptable. The Bielski brothers proved that even in history's darkest moments, individuals can make choices that illuminate the entire human experience. They showed that resistance doesn't always require armies. Sometimes it requires simply refusing to abandon your humanity. Modern visitors walking through the same forests where the Bielski group once hid. Today, visitors can walk the paths where Tuvia, Asael, Zus, and Aaron Bielski led their extraordinary community. The trees have grown taller, the clearings have changed, but the spirit of resistance lives on. The story of the Bielski brothers reminds us that heroism isn't always found on battlefields or in history books. Sometimes it's found in the decision to shelter a frightened child, to share your last piece of bread, to choose hope when everything suggests despair. They saved us not just from death, but from despair. In the darkest time in Jewish history, they lit a candle that still burns today. The Bielski brothers understood a truth that transcends any single conflict or era, that our humanity is measured not by our ability to destroy, but by our willingness to preserve, protect, and give hope to those who have none. In the forests of Belarus, 4 brothers from a small village proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can still find a way to shine.